start off this video, I want to make it clear that just because in my first video I started my criticism of the new Rurouni Kenshin talking about the more exaggerated and cartoony faces, that doesn't mean that was my only reason for not liking the new Rurouni Kenshin. If you watch the rest of that video, you'll very quickly realize that while I do see the original Rurouni Kenshin as funnier, more inventive, and energetic than the new one, I also think it handles the serious and dramatic moments more tactfully, artfully, and just better than the new one. The reason I'm talking about this specifically is that it seems to be one of the only things people who didn't like that video comment about. Another thing people like to say is that I only dislike the new version of the show because it's not the same as the original, and I feel like the reason this is such a common comment across all of my old versus new videos is because of how much I constantly compare the two shows, so let me just make things clear. The new adaptation of Rurouni Kenshin is bad and still would be bad if the original anime never existed. If I wanted, I could just make this video solely about the new adaptation and criticize it just fine, and that's because I base all of my criticism on what I value in a story. And if the original Rurouni Kenshin didn't exist, my values wouldn't just suddenly change. The only reason I keep going back to the original is because that's kind of the whole point of a comparison video. I thought it would be clear that I was just evaluating these two shows based on their own merits and rationalizing why I like one better than the other, which is what a lot of people do anyway for shows in general. Like, you wouldn't hear someone use this argument to poke holes into the reasons why someone holds something like Chainsaw Man in higher regard than Demon Slayer for just comparing them to each other. It should be the same for readaptations. If they're not continuations of the original, they should be treated as separate shows. With that out of the way, this video will focus on the way the new Rurouni Kenshin introduces its two other main characters, and I'm pretty sure everybody saw this coming, but I don't like the way it goes about doing that. So let's go in chronological order here and start with Yahiko. From the beginning of episode 2, it should be abundantly clear what this episode is about. Kaoru makes note of how no one's come back to her dojo, resulting in her still having no students to teach, and right after this scene, they have a chance encounter with Yahiko. So this episode is clearly about introducing this character and integrating him into the main cast, except that's where the main problem with this episode comes in. Instead of tackling one story at a time, the new adaptation tries to go for a little double jeopardy here. Meet Yamagata, or as I like to call him, a distraction. There is no reason to force both of these storylines into a single episode, because it only serves to cut into the time that should be spent developing the actually important part, the part that this episode was trying to set up from the beginning. And the way this character is utilized here just leaves no room for mystery or intrigue or tension at all. The first scene he appears in, he's presented as this friendly but important man, which could be a facade, but in the second scene, he immediately divulges exactly what he's here for, and not only that, but he also goes even further to go into detail on how he sees the main character, entirely eliminating this person as a threat or anything else that makes the story more interesting. Point being, this was a pointless distraction, and on its own, it doesn't do much to make up for that. I can see someone making the argument that the mixture of these two stories makes Yahiko's rejection of his current lifestyle feel more organic, and this is because at the end of the second episode, Yahiko sees Kenshin defend Kaoru from a group of corrupt samurai policemen, which later encourages him to do the right thing. This is indicated by the scenes where he is returning a dropped wallet to an elderly woman and saying "fuck you" to the guys extorting him for money. And my response to that potential counter-argument is, yeah, it does end up having that effect, an effect the episode would have already had without it. While some of the scenes showcasing this are a bit overt, they at least get the point across. Yahiko is being forced into this life of crime. Yahiko is actually a good person deep down. If all the show needed was an inciting incident to get Yahiko to take a stand against his loan sharks, I don't know what else to call them, the show could have accomplished that in a myriad of ways without dedicating a large portion of this episode to the subplot for honestly very little payoff. But this isn't the worst problem with Yahiko's introduction. The real problem actually comes from episode 3. The first 5 minutes of this episode feel like a goddamn speedrun, which makes use of really lazy exposition in order to tell the audience why Yahiko is even working for these people in the first place. These thugs are literally beating the shit out of him right now and going over every detail of his life that led him to this point. The way the scene progresses, it feels very much like someone trying their best to summarize a story as quickly as possible by only hitting the most vital bullet points to make people understand what's happening and why this is important. And all of this could be solved by just not doing this. I mean, you've already painted a general picture of what's going on here in the second episode. Do we really need this extra bit of context that doesn't contribute anything other than leading into a forced scene of Yahiko defending his parents' honor? It really only serves as a lacking build-up to the arrival of Kenshin, who just wraps everything everything up and saves the day, so whoop-de-doo, I guess. And yes, the original adaptation also told us directly why Yahiko was working as a pickpocket and gave us that extra bit of context when they've already painted a general picture of his situation, but the reason why it's not a problem is the fact that that version of the anime minimizes things down to a single, simple, but still adequate explanation for Yahiko's actions. His parents just went into debt. None of this stupid, your dad only had $300 and fed 2 people, he stood up against the Imperial Army early in the Revolution, or your mother was a whore. They just have this lady tell the main characters in a matter-of-fact and not overblown way what's the deal, and that also serves a greater purpose of pushing the story along by incentivizing Kaoru to try and save Yahiko from his terrible situation. Actually, let's talk more about that. A major improvement the original adaptation came up with for this story was making Kaoru go on her own to stick up for this kid at first, which plays into and sets up their future bond as teacher and student while also showing this character's more likable and honorable qualities in a more organic and better way than that expository outburst he had in the new version. Actually, the original version is better at characterizing Yahiko in general, like in the very first interaction between him and Kenshin. It's a really cute scene that telegraphs exactly what this kid is thinking, as well as what kind of person he is, purely through visuals alone. In this one short scene, we get all of the information we need to know about him. 1, he's a pickpocket, and 2, he has a heart of gold. Just simple, short, and sweet, and to the point, but not rushed or clumsy. I also think the placement of the scene was better too, considering it was near the beginning and was very effective at immediately endearing you to this character. It's a good example of show, don't tell when Kenshin sees what Yahiko does here. It gives him more of a reason to care for this kid and say what he does on the bridge, and the way he pats him on the head already establishes a pretty cool connection between the two. The counterpart version of this scene in the new adaptation is a lot less subtle, taking a nearly identical situation to the first adaptation and having Kenshin monologuing over it, basically spoon-feeding you the point of the scene, instead of letting this very simple to understand gesture speak for itself. Speaking of this scene, this was not in the manga. In actuality, Yahiko's introduction and storyline in the new adaptation is handled very differently from the manga, since another difference is that in the manga, Yamagata and Yahiko were handled in 2 different chapters. They were part of 2 different self-contained stories with no connection to the other whatsoever. So what was the reason behind mixing these 2 episodic scenarios together? Well, obviously it's partly to fill enough time for an entire episode, as neither chapter on their own could be 24 minutes long, but I don't think that's the only reason. I mean, if it was, there would be no need to connect these 2 storylines and have them happen at the same time, constantly interrupting the other thing that they're trying to do. They would just have to have the first half of this episode adapt the second chapter of the manga, and the second half of the episode adapting the third chapter. Also, why add multiple scenes that weren't in the manga if it meant having to tack a resolution to Yahiko's introduction onto the beginning of episode 3? Both of these things are counterintuitive to their goal of just adapting the manga faithfully. So why? Well, it doesn't matter why. The whole purpose of me bringing this up was just to make fun of manga readers, so here comes the extremely obtuse and insufferable logic of episodes 2 and 3 were not faithful to the manga, therefore it is bad, and with no further elaboration or explanation, we will now move on. We're still not done talking about the problems with this episode. As I mentioned before, Kenshin pretty much resolves the issue with the loan sharks within the first 7 minutes of episode 3, so the second half of that episode is about integrating Yahiko into the dojo as Kaoru's student. But the scenario the show tries to use to bring these 2 closer together is just so laughable and petty, which is embarrassing when you factor in how it tries so hard to imbue this scene with a level of gravitas that is just not fitting for it. The center of conflict for this part of the show is quite literally a drunken squabble between 2 former students of Kaoru's dojo who, in this version of the show, we haven't even seen before, and another vaguely written dojo group who just popped into existence for the sole purpose of having another villain of the week this time around. And even with this premise that should be really easy to explain, the show still has to rely on Yahiko making some pretty weird logical leaps in order to deduce the fact that Kaoru's former students were the ones who actually started this shit. So when they start acting like this is such a big betrayal and portraying Kaoru as the saint for forgiving them and being willing to accept the punishment they deserve for them, it makes this dissonance between what I'm seeing and what the show wants me to see, which makes it difficult for the moment to work. And it also makes it difficult to believe that Kaoru's and Yahiko's relationship would progress from this. I know it does because the show is forcing me to see it in that way, but when Yahiko sticks up for Kaoru, it doesn't feel justified because A, their relationship literally just started, and B, the situation isn't serious enough or cool enough to make it organically feel as if Kaoru's actions during this moment are enough to change the way Yahiko perceives her. It would be one thing if this was a situation where they were forced to work together in order to resolve this problem through their teamwork alone, because while that might have been a little cheesy, maybe it would have changed their relationship in an actually substantial way. But that's not even what happens. The problem is resolved as quickly as it becomes a thing due to Kenshin Deus Ex Machina, even though the show actively sets up the fact that Kenshin would not be there to help. And if you'll notice so far, the episodes seem to follow a formula of some vague threat being set up for Kenshin to get his badass moment at the end, without doing anything more than just making Kenshin look cool. And these episodes are specifically designed to make Kenshin's entrance at the end feel artificially impressive. When you look at how he actually functions within the plots of these episodes, what is he really? He's a plot device. A plot device who's just some way of getting other characters out of a pinch, and very half-assed pinches at that. Now, it's more or less the same in the original, but at least he was a good plot device there. To show what I mean, let's take a look at how the original adaptation handles this plot beat. Instead of adapting this chapter about the drunk former students, the original adaptation instead uses Yamagata as a way of accomplishing the same thing that chapter tried to do. In the original, Yamagata wasn't shown to be who he was until near the end. They kept his face hidden in shadows and made him refrain from speaking as much as possible until the big reveal that he's actually an upstanding guy who respects Kenshin. And because of the fact that he was looking for the notorious manslayer, i.e. Kenshin, Kaoru and Yahiko for good reason assumed the worst and worked together to try and protect Kenshin. Even ignoring the fact that the original had a bit of a head start by involving Kaoru and Yahiko's rescue, it's pretty clear in this episode that these two characters are brought together by their mutual respect for Kenshin. It's something that you can see in a scene as simple as the two of them angrily eating rice balls together. The connection between these two characters was earned, it was natural, but in the new adaptation, it just feels like forced progression. And that all leads to a pretty shallow resolution scene that only really works because the scene is presenting itself as something more than it is, a feeling that the narrator greatly contributes to. This should be a given, but if you need a narrator to tell you how to feel about a certain development, there might be something wrong. So the episodes of the original adaptation add in scenes of Yahiko having genuinely meaningful interactions with both Kaoru and Kenshin, which the new adaptation doesn't have. And I think we can all agree that regardless of the fact that these moments were in the original, the new adaptation could have greatly benefited from their inclusion, or the inclusion of something that made the bond between these characters feel more real. On top of the foundations for their relationships being better solidified in the original, the OG show also does a better job of giving us these little peeks into the more mundane elements of the characters' daily lives in the midst of the action. My favorite example being this very nice scene of all the characters just relaxing in the dojo in episode 4. It's a very quiet moment where the only sound comes from Kaoru flipping the pages in her book, Kenshin sipping his tea, and the slight snoring of the doctor and his grandchildren. It's such an understated yet intimate scene where all the characters seem to silently be enjoying each other's company. It's clear that they're very familiar with and comfortable around each other, and it's stuff like this that makes them feel like a close, tightly knit family. Speaking of episode 4 of the original Rurouni Kenshin, let's talk about episode 4 of the new one. This episode is surprisingly pretty decent since it's the first one that feels like it was cohesive and knew how to tell a functional story. It was helped in large part due to the strong focus on setting up a clash between Kenshin and Sanosuke. Even something like Kihei's inclusion is fine because this time he only serves as a way to give Sanosuke a reason to fight Kenshin, and this is without having stupid or convoluted reasons for doing so. He just wants to get revenge on Kenshin for what happened in episode 1, which is a good, simple reason for him to be included in this plot. Although his inclusion does come with a little bit of sloppiness. It's not that big of an issue, but the way he just shows up without any prior indication that he would be important again is pretty sudden and jarring at first. It's not really a big problem, I just think it would be easy to fix and make for a more tightly written plot. Something else that they could have left out was this really weird bit where the villains were complaining about the fact that Sanosuke just vanished for a bit only for him to show up and say he was collecting information on Kenshin before his fight with the guy. This kind of scene is pointless because it's no different from Dead Space, just there to fill for time. I mean, Kenshin's a famous legendary warrior. It wouldn't be weird for Sanosuke to already know all of this information about him, and we don't even see him doing this, so what's the point in making a scene where this guy just talks about what he did off screen? This clumsiness also extends to how the show tells you about Sanosuke's character. Like with Yahiko, they resort to this weird monologue where Sanosuke just yells about his hatred for imperialists and details every reason as to why he hates imperialists. It's like watching someone reading a Wikipedia description of his own personality. The original counterpart's version of this episode fixes all of these problems. They add in a scene where we see the villain from the first episode watching the main characters ominously before going to hire Sanosuke to fight them. They also make it so that Sanosuke goes off to fight Kenshin as soon as he's told about his true identity, basically implying that he already had the information he needed from the beginning, which would be normal considering how well known Kenshin is. And when Sanosuke yells at Kenshin, he only mentions that he hates imperialists without explaining why. This change leaves a lot more to the imagination and doesn't feel as overbearing jarring as what he says in the new adaptation. They also do a better job of making this confrontation feel more significant, with this hype badass track playing in the background as Sanosuke walks over to Kaoru's dojo, with his face occasionally being obscured with shadows. It's nighttime, which as an edgelord weeb, it's cool, so yeah. And just one more thing to mention is the way that they take care of Gohei in this episode. Instead of interrupting the confrontation between Kenshin and Sanosuke and stalling the fight for even longer, they just have Kenshin take care of him in a swift but entertaining way in the middle of it. In the new one, Kihei and Gohei are both there, but Kihei is the only one that matters because he ominously flashes his gun and the characters abruptly decide to deal with him first, change locations to another place, and then start fighting. It's really bizarre. The original adaptations version of this episode fixes a lot of the problems that the new one has, makes things a lot moodier, and becomes more tightly written as a result. The original adaptations episode is better, but the new one isn't bad. It's probably the best episode of the new one so far. Episode 5, on the other hand, is a different story. It's quite the return to form for the new adaptation, diving into a flashback and going straight back to lazy and expository dialogue in order for the audience to understand what the hell is going on here. Things ranging from having these random villagers discussing the law these soldiers are here to enforce and why it's a good thing for them, to making the narrator say the same exact thing those random villagers already told us, to having the captain of the squad randomly talk about his ideals and what drives him as a character, to Sanosuke describing himself as the son of a farmer as if it's this common thing people do in daily conversation here. This kind of writing is everywhere in this flashback, which makes these really important and impactful scenes feel dry and devoid of emotion. Now let's talk about the original adaptations version of this flashback. Immediately, it's not as drawn out because this version doesn't hire Morgan Freeman to very dryly convey information to the audience through narration. It just starts on the conversation Sanosuke has with his captain, which in all fairness is still a pretty lazy way to establish information about this character's motives and ideals, but at least makes for an interesting change in tone when the inspirational and stupidly optimistic feeling immediately disappears when this high-ranking official comes in. It also helps that this flashback is broken into 2 parts and shown to us in different parts of the episode. One part, the one I just talked about, takes place before Kenshin's and Sanosuke's second fight, and the other happens once Sanosuke gets knocked out during it. It's much more effective when you create some intrigue at first. When the first flashback gets cut off, you're probably wondering what happened after, what was with that ominous tone at the end, and once you find out further into the episode, the show actually does a pretty good job of making you feel for the situation. They do this by specifically focusing on the unfairness of it all. They actually show you things like the brutal murders of all of the members of the Sekio army and the realization of betrayal that both Sagara and Sanosuke had to go through. I especially like this shot. It's pretty scary imagining what's happening to the people these shadows belong to, and having Sanosuke as a child physically be there and witness all of this makes the situation so much more compelling. The only part that Sanosuke, and by extension the audience, gets to see in the new version is the aftermath, where Captain Sagara's head is just sitting there, which, to be fair, it is a pretty haunting image, but it's the only thing that makes me feel anything in this flashback. The original anime also tries to establish a bigger theme in all of this, outside of the more basic conflict going on between Kenshin and Sanosuke. See, the original adds in a scene where Kaoru and Yahiko are told about the Sekio army, but the information they're given contradicts the ideals of the captain in Sanosuke's first flashback, which leads to a situation where every character, not just Sanosuke, is viewing the situation in black and white terms. Kaoru and Yahiko brand Sanosuke as a bad person based on nothing but hearsay. It's honestly tragic to see how the truth of the matter gets buried here, which ties into some of the things said in Sanosuke's second flashback. In war, whoever wins is good and whoever loses is evil. It's a really dumb principle, but it turns out to be kind of true because of how much information the victors can manipulate. The losers in this case being the Sekio army, who are dead and can no longer tell their side of the story. And seeing this being reflected in Kaoru and Yahiko makes the message of the story hit harder, showing these kinds of flaws in the main characters and showing that they're just as susceptible to making that kind of mistake causes me to reflect on it more. It makes me see it as a more common and human problem. So when Kaoru and Yahiko defend Kenshin from Sanosuke, it means something. When Sanosuke drops his fighter's name and decides that titles like manslayer don't mean anything, that act means something. By expanding on this idea of black and white thinking, the original adaptation actually manages to create a subtle but powerful underlying theme that connects all of the characters and events of this episode together in a meaningful way. And the new version of this episode doesn't have that, which is what makes it feel sloppy and, more than anything else, cheap. The scenes I mentioned earlier are in the new adaptation, but a payoff without a proper foundation isn't earned. In the original, there's more than just the flashback that makes you sympathize with Sanosuke. It doesn't entirely rely on that to make Sanosuke an interesting character. He's interesting because he comments on a problem that is very prevalent, something we can see affecting the main characters. That's the main problem with this episode, so moving on to more minor problems such as Kihei comically having 2 guns. I get the impression that this is being played straight, but the way he just pulls it out and it comes out of nowhere just makes this whole gun ordeal starting from episode 4 feel like a huge setup for a gut-busting punchline. So much so, in fact, that I'm pretty sure I've seen this exact scene in a freaking Pro ZD skit. This also happens right after the flashback of Sagura's death, so any kind of impact or dramatic tension this moment had is completely gone now. The last thing I'd like to mention is I just like Sanosuke's interactions with the rest of the group a lot more in the original because of that show's better sense for comedic timing. It actually knows how to sell a joke. That's helped by the fact that it's so much more energetic and alive than the new one, which is something I mentioned in the previous video, but I figured I'd still make a note of it here.